Japan has raised its key interest rate from minus 0.1% to between 0% and 0.1%, ending a negative rate policy that was adopted in 2016. So why was the negative rate policy adopted? And what prompted the latest shift in policy from negative to positive? Also, what are the broader implications of this monetary policy shift? Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we touch upon Tokyo's recent decision to raise its benchmark interest rate for the first time since 2007 and to end a negative rate policy adopted back in the year 2016. For more, I have Professor Kim Sei-wan at Ewha Womans University live on the line. Professor Kim, welcome.
Thanks for having me today.
I also have Professor Sayuri Shirai at Keio University live on the line as well. Professor Shirai, it's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Right, Professor Shirai, let's begin with some background information regarding the Bank of Japan's monetary policy. First then, why did Japan adopt a negative monetary policy back in the year 2016? And what was the response from pundits back then to this move?
Actually, I was a board member at Bank of Japan in those days, and I voted against this decision to introduce negative interest rate. I think my understanding is that in those days, there was a heightened global uncertainties because since the middle of 2015, there was a China's depreciation of their currency and the sharp fall in the Chinese stock prices. And there was also uncertainty in the German commercial banks. So then yen started to appreciate and yen started to appreciate below 120 against US dollars. I think that kind of led to this decision to introduce additional monetary easing in 2016.
Right, I see. And Professor Kim, for some broader perspective, I believe Japan was not actually the first nation to adopt a negative rate policy, right?
That's correct. Actually, people are not familiar with negative interest rate because it means that you pay something to banks when you deposit money at the banks. But as you said, several central banks had implemented negative interest rate as part of their response to economic conditions in 21st century. For example, Switzerland Central Bank introduced a negative interest rate in December 2014 to counteract the appreciation of Swiss franc. Also, Swedish Central Bank, Swedish Riksbank, also implemented negative interest rates in 2015 to stimulate economic growth and combat deflationary pressures. But it should be noted that among the major economies, Japan has been the only example of negative interest rate by central bank. Bank of Japan's negative interest rate policy from 2001, as far as I know, gave an important lesson to other central banks like U.S. Federal Reserve when they were about to adopt zero interest rate policy after the outbreak of global financial crisis in 2008. To most of Western major central bank, therefore, zero interest rate was something unprecedented policy, and Japan's long experiences with zero and negative interest rate policy gave them assurance on implementation of zero interest rate policy after 2008's global financial crisis.
Right, I see. Back in Japan then, Professor Shirai, what appears to have prompted monetary policymakers there to raise their interest rates for the first time, I believe, in some 2 decades? And how do you respond to this move?
Mm-hmm. So Bank of Japan has been doing this unconventional monetary easing even before negative interest rate, especially over these 10 years under the previous governor, Kuroda. And I think people kind of fed up with this idea of maintaining low interest rate. And the banks and a lot of market participants, they like to have a more, interest volatility because they can, make more money and, more businesses and financial asset development become possible. So I think when new governor came from Ueda came last April, I think people anticipated that there will be policy change. And I think this time, BOJ, they never say it, but they always worry about the side effect imposed by this negative interest rate on commercial banks. So maybe they thought this is the opportunity for them to remove this negative interest rate while inflation is above 2%.
Right. And that being said, Professor Kim, what look to be some of the broader implications of this move by the Bank of Japan for perhaps Korea?
Thanks to higher interest rate in Japan, yen will be more expensive, first of all. So to general Korean people, it means that travel to Japan will be more expensive because Japan's yen will be more appreciated. After the end of the COVID pandemic, Japan has been #1 foreign destination to many Korean people. Last year, a quarter of foreign visitors to Japan was Korean. And there are many, I think, reasons for Korean people to visit Japan, like attractive sightseeing spots in Japan. But another main reason should be huge depreciation of yen against Korean won in the last 2 years. That made travel to Japan the most cost-effective against their joy of travel. And higher interest rate in Japan and appreciation of yen together will help to increase Korean export because Korean won will be slightly depreciated against US dollars and yen. Since the two countries' products between Japan and Korea are competing in global market like automobiles and ships, cheaper Korean won or depreciated Korean won generated by higher interest rate in Japan would edge up Korean export for this year.
Right. And Professor Shirai, how does this latest shift in monetary policy by the Bank of Japan look to affect the ordinary Japanese household as well as the small and mid-sized businesses there?
Mm-hmm. So far, the impact is really small because BOJ's policy made fundamental changes, but on the short-term interest rate, just a tiny increase from small negative to plus 0.07. So it's very tiny increase. So far, there was a very small increase in deposit rate, but just around 0.001%. So nothing really changed. And so far, commercial bank hasn't raised their lending rate, so remain at 0.3%. So overall, the Japanese interest rate remain really low. And I think main reason is because BOJ didn't want to increase the long-term interest rate a lot. So they continue to buy lots of JGB, about the same amount, monthly amount. So that's why it didn't really make a big changes on interest rate. But at this moment, situation like this, but who knows? Some market participants have a different view about Japanese growing debt, and they may have a different sentiment, and the movement may happen. But so far, the impact on the interest rate is very limited.
Right. Professor Shirai, broadly speaking, how do you assess the state of Japan's economy and what perhaps needs to be done to perhaps ensure its stability?
Japanese economy is very weak. So last year, we had this real GDP growth of 1.9%, looks great. But if we look at the consumption over this past 3 quarters, we had a declining real consumption, mainly because of these high imported prices. Like Professor mentioned, that foreigners enjoy, cheap goods and services in Japan, but all Japanese are suffering. We all feel worse off. Everything becomes so expensive, food prices and so on. So consumption is dropping, and our wages do not catch up with inflation. So real wages are dropping. So economy is really weak and sluggish. So how can we change? It's an aging society. So our population, senior people account for 30%. And so if we look at the real consumption over 25 years, the annual increase in real consumption was just 0.6%. so almost stagnant consumption economy. So from this perspective, also very difficult for BOJ to maintain 2% in stable manner based on this demand-driven, wage price virtuous cycle. That hasn't happened yet.
Right, I see. Professor Kim, Professor Shirai just mentioned Japan's aging society, and that is not simply a Japanese problem. It's also a reality here in South Korea. In fact, there's been quite a bit of concern shared about Korea's workforce starting in the year 2028, I believe, Professor Kim. Do touch upon these concerns for us, and what are your suggestions to tackling these concerns?
Well, I'm glad that you raised this point related to rapid Korean aging situation, Sunny. Korea will begin to see shrinkage in both its workforce and its economically active population in 2028 as a result of its super low fertility rate and rapidly aging demographics. Among the OECD member countries, these members are relatively rich countries. Japan is the oldest society in terms of a relative size of old people over 65 years old. At the same time, Korea is the fastest aging society among OECD member countries. So as a result, what we know for sure is that Korea will be the #1 aged economy, and Japan will be #2 aged society by 2045. So this fast population structure change dismantles the basis of the Korean economy. It further generates more instability in Korean economy. It looks that it is not possible to increase young population in the short run because it is related to so many intertwined social problems in South Korea. The only way to avoid sudden shortages of workers is accepting more immigrants from abroad and utilizing more female workers. So there needs to be more flexible and wider immigration policy and female-friendly labor market to maintain international manufacturing and industry competitiveness in the future.
Right, and expanding on what Professor Kim has just mentioned about coming up with more female-friendly policies in the workforce, Professor Shirai, I understand Japan has been seeking to bolster its shrinking workforce by implementing policies that is targeting its female population. What more can you share with us?
Yeah, so we started to see a lot of female workers, taking a, high-ranking position, but still very limited. I think part of the reason is that still women have to take care of children and the elderly people. Remember, in aging society, somebody have to take care of elderly parents. So women tends to do it. So still, this balancing this, home, taking care of parents between men and women are not equally shared, and so that is a problem. And also, company have to do more. Find a way to promote more female workers in a more flexible working environment, and still a lot of women have to work at the company. So online working environment is not fully implemented.
Professor Shirai, Professor Kim had mentioned the idea of opening doors to immigration as one way of boosting the workforce. Is this a policy proposal that perhaps Japan is considering in the long run?
So we started to see a growing number of foreign workers in Tokyo. I see so many foreigners living, in my apartment and everywhere. So certainly we started to see an increasing number of foreign workers. But I guess eventually government have to do a bit more to accept foreign workers and together with their families, more permanent basis. That I think Japan hasn't done in a drastic way.
And speaking about permanent migration, Professor Kim, could permanent migration be a tangible solution for Korea's shrinking and aging population, do you think?
Yes, it could be. But it should be pointed out that accepting foreign workers in a larger scale causes unexpected social unrest, according to experiences of other countries. For example, recently, Sweden is experiencing serious social conflicts after having huge workers from Middle East countries. And personally, I don't think that the Korean people in general are emotionally ready for this huge inflows of foreign workers. So Korean government should be explaining the purpose of accepting foreign workers to citizens for gaining agreements from people. Also, as we talked about, Korean females' labor market participation rate is about 55%, and it is only less than 80% of males' labor market participation rate. Actually, Korean females' labor market participation rate is simply the lowest among OECD member countries, which is sad. So there is a large room for having more female workers in Korea. And we know that it does not come for free. Lots of inefficiencies and obstacles related to female workers working in Korean society should be lessened through government policy and social movements.
Right, for sure, to bolster our workforce then. And speaking about the shrinking workforce, Professor Shirai, Japan, like Korea, it's also facing a very dismal birth rate. And that being said, what policies are in place there in Japan to tackle this social dilemma?
Mm-hmm. So working age populations between 15-year-old and 64 years old are already dropping since 1995. So, so what happens is that if you look at the number of employed workers, the number is not dropping. So it means the gap was offset by increasing number of senior pensioners. They take part-time job, and also female housewife. And the Japanese government introduced a very interesting pension system. So if people postpone the receival of the pension and they work longer, and then they can get more pension in the future. So during their working time, the government does not need to pay pension, so they can save those monies.
Right, so that is one proposal then. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this discussion. Professor Shirai over in Japan, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Kim here in Seoul, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we say goodbye. We return same time tomorrow, that is Wednesday, so do join us then.